Hello, everybody. It's good to see you again today. And for those of you who are playing along at home, yes, I am recording this the same time as our lecture from last week. I'm wearing the same shirt. So in case anybody was wondering, yes, that does happen. Professors sometimes record all of our lectures, boom, 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 boom. So in case anybody was using the rhetorical critical skills to describe and interpret my clothing, yes, I did, in fact, record all of these at the same time. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about research questions. So you have a reading today that you're talking about the craft of research and moving from problems to questions and then questions on forward. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And the important thing to remember here is not all research questions are created equal. I want to put that out there again. Not all research questions are good research questions. Some research questions are great. Some truly are not. And it's important that as rhetorical critics, we pick rhetorical questions that are important for two particular reasons. First, they must be questions that you can answer with your text. They must be questions that you can answer with your text. Here, text is thought of broadly as both text and context. But that's the first one. The second is they must be questions that you can answer with rhetorical methods. So we're going to talk about those two things today, and I want to break them down a little bit for you. So let's think first. They must be questions that can be answered by your text and context. If we go back to our definition of text, I have mine right up here on the wall above my office so I can see them for our class this semester. I've defined text as a discernible unit of communication. And then we've expanded that a little bit to talk about how it happens within a context. And so we describe and we interpret and we evaluate texts. And one of the important things to know about rhetorical research questions is they must be something that you can answer from a particular text. So if I was to ask, how does Susan B. Anthony feel about being imprisoned for voting fraudulently? I could not answer that question by looking at her speech. I could answer a question, how does she articulate her feelings? How does she express her feelings to an audience? But I have no way of telling how she actually felt. I would need to look at her journal entries and hope that they were journal entries that talk about her feelings. They never are. She does not talk about her feelings in any of her writing. Not a thing. I would need to look at letters that she wrote to a friend. Now there, she talks about her feelings. She wrote so much about her feelings to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she wasn't actually upset about getting arrested. She was upset about being freed. She wanted to make a habeas corpus presentation to the United States Supreme Court, and being freed undercut that ability for her. But I couldn't answer that question about her feelings just by looking at her speech text, right? I need to make sure that any research question I ask is something I can answer by looking at the text. And so let's take a look at some questions that cannot be answered by looking at particular texts. How did people feel about? Really? How is a speech by a rhetor going to tell you what the audience felt? You would need an entirely different text. You might be able to use Twitter responses. You might be able to use video of the audience nodding along or booing and throwing rotten tomatoes. But the text itself doesn't tell you how the audience felt. What were people's reactions? Not what we're looking at, right? Unless the text you're looking at is a response to somebody else's text, that's not a question your text can answer. What was the popular opinion about? Maybe if you were looking primarily at historical text and you wanted to use like 20 or 30 or 40 of them in order to frame how people felt right before like Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. But that is way too big for your project. That is a master's level or PhD level project. Don't get into those. Trust me, I've done that. You don't want to do that. Instead, ask questions that can be answered by the text. How does this text articulate a vision for the future? How does this text change the generic conventions of epideictic rhetoric? How does this text use a metaphor or a narrative to push the rhetor's particular purpose? How does this text? Is always a great place to start. If you're asking a question about the text, it's hard to go wrong with answering it with the text. The second important point that it's really vital to know as a rhetorical critic is that our research questions must be answered by our methods, right? We have here a list of at least 9 of the most popular rhetorical criticism methods for young scholars and of generative criticism, something that's used by more scholarly professionals, something that myself and Dr. Downing and Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Dillard and all of our other professors who do rhetorical criticism, that's the type that we generally use as more practiced professional critics who do this for a living. You must, though, answer a question or ask a question that you can answer with your methods. For instance, rhetoric criticism cannot tell you the pollution levels of water in Lake Oconee. We don't do that. We don't use test tubes. We don't use measuring systems in laboratories to measure pollution. You couldn't say how much pollution is actually in Lake Oconee. You could ask, how do local elected officials respond to rising pollution levels in local waterways? That is a rhetorical question. You're looking for local officials, maybe our county commissioner, maybe the city mayor. You're looking for their responses when context tells us that pollution levels have risen. You might look at the narratives they tell to say that the power plant is far more important to people's jobs than the pollution is to just a few fish. You might look for a metaphor of how it's our responsibility to protect our Mother Earth. Now, the Mother Earth metaphor shapes resistance to the new power plant. You might take a look at the fantasy theme analysis and how they create a vision of what happens when pollution is cleaned up. But you're looking at rhetoric. By the same token, we do not, as rhetorical critics, go out and measure people's popular opinion. We don't go and look at surveys. We don't go and look at census data. We don't go and do interviews. Those are particular ways of finding texts, but they're not the method of rhetorical criticism. The method of rhetorical criticism is to examine texts. Remember, we believe as critics that texts themselves have power to shape our world. What we do is we understand as critics how the world is created through words. So always make sure that when you're asking a rhetorical criticism question, it can be answered by your text and context, and it can be answered by the methods of rhetorical criticism. Bring some practice research questions with you to class this week. We are going to work on research questions. Bring at least 5 possible research questions. At least 5, I'm going to say it one more time, 5, at least 5 rhetorical research questions that can be answered by your text and answered with rhetorical criticism methods. I can't wait to see you all in class. Bye, everybody.